From Campbell Hall at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, this is a debate between the Democratic candidates for Congress in Illinois' 13th Congressional District. Meadows. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Illinois and WILL Illinois Public Media, I welcome all of you watching and listening on WILL and the other stations carrying this debate throughout the 13th District. And I welcome those of you taking part in our live chat going on now at will.illinois.edu. The questions that the candidates will answer this evening were based in part upon a survey of students from community colleges and universities in the 13th District. But the questions in their final form are the responsibility of our panel of 3 reporters. From Springfield, Patrick Yeagle of the Illinois Times. From Decatur, Allison Petty of the Herald and Review. And from Champaign-Urbana, Jill Deasis, editor-in-chief of the student newspaper, the Daily Illini. And I also welcome the audience joining us in the studio this evening. They include supporters of both candidates. And they have agreed to remain silent and not applaud or boo the candidates during the debate. But right now, I invite you all to give a round of applause as we introduce the 2 candidates, Matt Gettin and David Gill. Mr. Matt Gettin lives in his hometown of Carrollton, where he's serving his 2nd term as the state's attorney for Greene County. He's a captain in the Illinois Air National Guard and served in Afghanistan during a previous tour of duty with the Illinois Army National Guard. This is Matt Gettin's first run for Congress. Dr. David Gill of Bloomington is an emergency room physician at Advocate Broman Regional Medical Center in Normal. Before moving into emergency medicine, Dr. Gill worked as a family practice physician. He previously ran for Congress in the old 15th District against Republican incumbent Tim Johnson in 2004, 2006, and 2010. We had hoped to schedule a debate featuring the Republican candidates in the 13th Congressional District, but Congressman Johnson declined our invitation, and the other 2 GOP candidates, Michael Fershing and Frank Metzger, failed to meet our criteria for participation. However, you can find material about all the candidates in this congressional race on our election website, will.illinois.edu/election. A word now about Illinois' new 13th Congressional District. It covers parts of the old districts represented by Congressman Tim Johnson and John Shimkus, reaching from Champaign-Urbana in east central Illinois over to Hardin in the southwest. It includes Springfield, Bloomington-Normal, Edwardsville, Decatur, Clinton, and Carrollton, among other communities. Mr. Gettin and Dr. Gill have agreed to a debate with no opening or closing statements and no set time limits for answers. I will decide when it's time to move from one question to the next. Our panel will be asking direct questions and seeking direct answers. Let's go now to our first question, and we're starting with questions about the economy. Allison Petty with the Herald and Review.
Mr. Gettin, the national debt is about $15 trillion. What are some specific steps that you believe Congress can take toward reducing it?
Well, Allison, if I may, you know, I have grown up here in Central Illinois. I, as it was stated in the opening, have a history of service, and I'm hoping to carry that forward to Congress. I have a jobs plan that I rolled out last week that I think has some specific language in there that can help reduce that. We have to get back to some tax fairness here in this country and immediately repeal the Bush tax cuts for the wealthiest of Americans. We have to look at the tax code. We have to find ways that we can put people back to work here in Central Illinois, but throughout the country. We have to find ways to increase the tax base by doing things like supporting small businesses. As a former business owner myself, I know how important it is I know how hard it is to meet a payroll. I know how important it is to put people to work. I know how that can help, taxpayers, more taxpayers on the toll, paying taxes. I know that if we get manufacturing back up to speed here in Central Illinois, rather than losing manufacturing as we have done in Greene and really Jersey County in the Metro East that I'm most familiar with, that helps fill that gap. But specifically putting people back to work, I mean, it helps.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Gill, your answer.
I initially wanted to state that I'm very pleased to be here. I'm glad that WILL is hosting this debate, and I'm glad that the League of Women Voters, of which I'm a member, is co-hosting. I guess that's letting you know that I'm a member of the League is full disclosure, so to speak. We had offered to have 6 or 8 or 10 of these debates, and for whatever reason, Mr. Gettin's campaign was unable or unwilling to accommodate that. We really wanted the voters to get a chance to know us, and so I'm thrilled that we have the one, and I'm glad that you guys have put it together. The $15 trillion deficit is really stark. It's something that can be dealt with, though. You know, when President Bush went into office, we had the greatest surplus in American history, and it's something that got created primarily during Tim Johnson's time. And, you know, the first things that I would do would be to reverse the things that Tim Johnson did that resulted in this deficit. The tax cuts, as Mr. Gettin indicated, need to be rescinded. We shouldn't be allergic, as true Democrats, we shouldn't be allergic to raising revenues in this country. The top marginal tax rate for the wealthiest people in this country who have been doing so well has been cut decade after decade to the point where we're really down to the bone, so to speak. It pleases people like Grover Norquist, but it makes life hard for everybody else. And so I see nothing wrong with raising taxes on the millionaires and billionaires who have been the only segment of American society that's been doing very well for the last many years. And we can cut spending as well. You know, I got a degree in mathematics here at the U of I, and you don't need a degree in math, though, to recognize that the way to repair a deficit is to raise revenues and cut spending. And we certainly don't need to be sending billions, up to $20 billion a year in subsidies to the oil companies who are making record profits every year, which everyone's aware of when they fill their gas tank each day. And the defense budget has also become extremely bloated. It's 3 times what it was in the late 1990s outside of the Afghanistan and Iraq situation. So there's steps to take. The other things that Mr. Johnson did that brought this calamity upon us were sending us into the 2 wars, the 2 decade-long wars, which have been a tremendous cost in many, many ways, not just financially. And he also was part of a prescription drug bill, a Medicare prescription drug bill that was a $2 trillion boondoggle to the taxpayers of this country, and is probably the clearest evidence of anything that we can talk about with regards to the fact that these guys in Washington, both parties, are owned by corporate America. When you sign off on a bill that says Uncle Sam may not negotiate on drug prices, it explicitly says that, then there's something wrong, because Uncle Sam has such bargaining power with 60 million Medicare lives worth of bargaining power. And, you know, it's this whole ownership of government by the multinational corporations and the Wall Street banks that I've been talking about for a long, long time, and that drives my campaign. I'm proud to be the one candidate in this race who has pledged to not take a penny from the corporations or the Wall Street banks.
Thank you both.
Our next question comes from Jill Deeses.
Dr. Gill, tuitions for college is increasing across the board, and students are taking out larger and larger loans in order to afford it. But even with a college education, the job market for these graduates is still bleak. Some sources are reporting as much as a quarter of recent graduates are unemployed. What do you think it will take for this job market to recover, and how would you as a federal representative address this issue in Congress?
It's an excellent question. And it's something that is asked of me at all of the colleges and the 6 large universities in this congressional district. And it's a shame that there's so many people coming out of school unable to find jobs. It's a shame that school costs so much. It wasn't like that when I went to school. I worked, but I was able to stock shelves in a department store and put myself through college, and mop floors in a laundromat in the middle of the night to get myself through medical school. These days you can't do that. You can't get a part-time job to cover the cost of tuition here. And again, I think it goes back to priorities again. I say all the time that had we followed my lead, I was arguing with Tim Johnson back in early 2003 before the invasion of Iraq. He shook his fist at me and said that I was unpatriotic. But I said, don't engage in this foolishness. Had we put that money that we have invested in Iraq into the invasion of Iraq, had we put that into free college for every young man and woman coming out of high school, it would have paid for free college for 50 to 100 years. And again, it's a question of priorities. And you ask about jobs, and again, I go back to the same old message that I've been saying for so long. You can't create jobs until you have a healthy economy, and you won't have a healthy economy until you have a Congress that has individuals within it who are not funded by United Healthcare and Shell Oil. We've seen what happens when the Democrats join in with the Republicans in taking the corporate cash. Then you get NAFTA, then you get CAFTA, then you get wars for oil, then you get healthcare reform that doesn't include so much as a small little public option. And we can't have a healthy economy when our congressmen and women should be wearing NASCAR outfits with the corporate logos on them. So again, I pride myself on the fact that our money comes from ordinary people, ordinary Americans who need help.
Thank you. Mr. Gettin, your response.
Well, I agree with David that it's about priorities, and that's why in my campaign I've been prioritizing jobs. I disagree with David that a healthy economy produces jobs. I think jobs produce a healthy economy. We have in Central Illinois infrastructure projects that need to be funded. We have a Congress that is broken and has lost sight of the fact that we have a transportation appropriations bill that keeps getting batted back and forth. Look, we have in the Metro East a 255-67 corridor project that's been stalled out in Greene and Jersey County. We have the 51 widening indicator. We have the high-speed rail. All of that relies on funding from Congress. We have, speaking of colleges and universities, and I know that was the question, in order to get the economy back on track, we have a fragile recovery underway currently. We have community college districts like Lewis and Clark Community College. You have partnership programs with unions, apprenticeship programs, and local business to put people back to work right away. We have right here on my alma mater, higher education programs, PhD programs, master's degree programs, bachelor's degree programs that put us to work in the long run. The fact that people are getting out of college with college debt, it's horrible. The fact that they can't find jobs is a failure of Congress to have the foresight to focus on what's important to middle-class families, and specifically here in Central Illinois. And that's why when I'm out talking to people in Central Illinois, that's what I hear them talking about. How is Congress going to help us get back to work? And it goes to your question about recent college graduates and putting them back to work.
Thank you both.
Our next question comes from Patrick Yeagle of the Illinois Times.
Mr. Gettin, Congress and President Obama continue to negotiate cost reductions for Medicare, with each political party accusing the other of effectively trying to end the program. Cutting through the partisan rhetoric, what can be done to save money on Medicare while still keeping the program viable and useful?
I think David raised an interesting point in his opening, and that is we should allow Medicare to negotiate directly with pharmaceutical companies like TRICARE does. As a member of the Illinois Army National Guard, now Air National Guard, my family and I rely on TRICARE Reserve Select as our means of affordable health care. TRICARE is allowed to do that, to negotiate prices directly with the companies for medicine. Look, affordable health care is extremely important. And in Greene County, even as the state's attorney, I could no longer afford my health coverage for my family, and so we do rely on that through the Air National Guard. something has got to be done about the rising healthcare costs, and that's one way. And I don't see that as a partisan issue. I see that as something that's already been implemented at other government insurance programs that could easily be implemented in Medicare.
Thank you. And Dr. Gill, your response.
Well, yeah, healthcare overall can be salvaged in this country. This is something that's very near and dear to me. I'm a physician. I've been involved in healthcare for 29 years. I joined a group 20 years ago called Physicians for a National Health Program. This is an advocacy group that has pushed and pushed and pushed for a single-payer program or improved Medicare for all, which is something that this country desperately needs. I listened to Mr. Gettin on the radio today, and he said he didn't believe that we could afford a single-payer program. In fact, we can't afford not to have a single-payer program. The way that it stands today, we throw away 40% of our giant healthcare budget into a black hole known as the private health insurance industry, and we need to take that money back. And when you take that back, you can easily, that's a huge sum of money, it's almost $1 trillion, you can take care of everybody, senior citizens, the working adults, young people, and it should have been done a long time ago. Harry Truman was talking about it, and it's far past time. I see too many people suffering and dying. We have an American citizen that dies every 12 minutes just because they lack health insurance in this country, and that's just a moral failure. I think if you're a true Democrat like I am, you can't tolerate that. And but again, these guys in Washington, they're owned by the insurance companies, they're owned by pharmaceutical companies, and until we have people in Washington, D.C. that will stand up and be funded by ordinary citizens and stand up for ordinary citizens, you're going to continue with healthcare as is. Even what got passed, the Affordable Care Act, really delivered 32 million to 36 million more customers into the clutches of a private health insurance industry that exists to return profit for its investors, not to make America healthy. We'll be far healthier and we'll be far wealthier with job creation. The National Nurses Union did a study 2 years ago that said 3 million new jobs the day after you put single-payer healthcare to work in this country. So that's one of the reasons that I really have a passion to get to Washington, to tell a lot of the stories of the people that are sick and dying because of the lack of this movement on healthcare.
Thank you, sir.
If I may respond.
Before we get on to our next question, Mr. Gettin, if you wanted to expand on your comments on single payer.
I would. You know, I appreciate that David pointed out that the health care is affordable, because I think in my answer I did state that affordable health care is what I'm talking about, not affordable insurance. But look, we opened this line of questioning with a $15 trillion debt that we're looking square in the face. David says we'll save 40% or whatever the figure that you're talking about. When you say we, the economy saves that. Someone's picking the bill up, and it's the federal government at a time when Congress is broken, and they're talking about ending Medicare as we know it, as the question went, at a time when they're talking about veterans who are not going to get their services that they need because we can't figure out how to pay for it, at a time when all of that is going on. I don't know how we can say we can afford what you're proposing.
I think we'll have to leave it at there. We have time for one more question, I think, in the economic section. And Allison Petty.
Okay. Dr. Gill, supporters of free trade agreements say, with countries such as South Korea, Panama, and Colombia, say that they have a positive effect on domestic agriculture. Opponents say that they send jobs overseas. So should the U.S. seek an expansion of free trade agreements?
No, I've argued against such free trade agreements for years and years, and I was alluding to that earlier. When the multinational corporations that put the funding into Congress people demand a NAFTA, demand a CAFTA, demand the free trade agreements that you're talking about this last year, it sucks jobs out of this country. Ross Perot cautioned us back in 1992 that should you pass NAFTA, that next sound you hear will be the giant sucking sound of jobs being taken out of America. And he was prophetic. He was right. If I might say, with respect to health care, the money is there. The money is there. 40% of it goes to people like William McGuire, who retired as the CEO of United Healthcare in 2006 with $1.6 billion. That's enough for Mr. McGuire to spend $100,000 a day on himself for 40 years. That money should be put into health care. And you take it back from the William McGuires, you put it into people's health care. We have the money. It's just a matter of who it's distributed to and what it's used for.
Thank you. Mr. Gettin, your thoughts on free trade?
Thank you. Well, free trade has been a horrible issue. I'm for fair trade. When we look at the issue of trade, how can our working men and women in Central Illinois compete with employees in other countries who don't have to meet the same environmental standards, don't have to meet the same health standards, don't have to meet the same standards, period? It's unfair. But let me tell you, there's a bright spot. I have in Greene County what we pride ourselves in Carrollton as the largest winery in Illinois. Now, I don't know if that's actually true, but that's what they say. That's on the brochure. So, but the man who owns that has recently told me he's increasing his exports to China. Now, I know that's small. I know it's Carrollton. I know it's just one winery, but that opportunity is there. In Grafton in Jersey County, Illinois, there's a group of investors who have, with the help of some people in the federal government, obtained some permitting to allow them to fish the invasive Asian carp species that is really wreaking havoc on our sport fishing in that basin and on our commercial fishing in that basin. They have a partnership program with the Chinese where they're going to fish that invasive Asian carp species and freeze dry it and ship it to China because the Chinese do use that as a consumptible fish. Those things are happening. We need more of that. We need to focus our energy on that. But free trade, no. Fair trade. Fair trade.
Thank you.
Let's move ahead to some questions on foreign policy issues. And Patrick Yeagle has a question about Iran.
Mr. Gettin, recent news reports tell of an ongoing covert war by unknown agents against Iran, centering around that country's nuclear program. How should the U.S. approach the growing tension between Iran and the Western world over Iran's nuclear program?
Well, let me state at the outset that a nuclear-armed Iran is an absolute no-go. As someone who has been in the military since 1999, as someone who served overseas in Afghanistan in 2009, I'm familiar with the issues involved in determining whether or not we go and put boots on the ground. It's very real to me. It's not abstract at all. But that said, we have to take a diplomatic approach. We have to use every resource available to us to solve this issue with diplomacy, but we can't be afraid as the United States to say this is unacceptable. We can't have the Iranians closing down the straits so that 20% of the world's oil gets choked off. In a time when I'm talking to voters in Central Illinois and working men and women in Central Illinois, $4 gas, how people with marginal discretionary income trying to figure out how they get to and from work, or people looking for work for that matter, trying to figure out how that happens. It doesn't happen if the straits are closed, if all of a sudden we get a spike to $6. That cannot happen, but a nuclear-armed Iran is absolutely something that we can't stand by.
Thank you. Dr. Gill, your response.
I'd like to start by thanking Mr. Gettin for his service. You mentioned your service, and I truly appreciate
Thanks,
that,
David.
Sincerely. I take care of a lot of veterans, and I always take pains to thank them for their service. There's nothing more noble that you can do, and I really appreciate it, Matthew. With Iran, there's no more complex foreign policy situation in the world right now, and all of the options appear to be bad at this point. There's not a good outcome that one can envision. We certainly can't allow Iran to have access to nuclear weaponry. The ramifications of having Israel attack Iran with or without our involvement are also, potentially disastrous. And so there's a lot of factors that go into the equation. At this point, I agree wholeheartedly with President Obama when he talks about exhausting every diplomatic option possible, when he talks about crippling economic sanctions. I think another important factor, though, as we look at Iran and what we're going to do with Iran is, again, how many factors go into a congressperson's decision-making process? If you're funded by the oil companies, if you're funded by the war makers, the weapons manufacturers, then that's going to be another variable that's thrown into the equation. Myself, as someone who's funded by ordinary citizens, and we've issued a challenge to my Republican opponent and my Democratic opponent to follow me in making that pledge to swear off any and all corporate dollars and Wall Street bank dollars. When you're a candidate that does that, then you can weigh options in Iran honestly, and with regards to having things turn out good for people here and overseas.
Thank you.
Since you brought it up, perhaps Mr. Gettin, did you want to comment on Dr. Gill's call for a no corporate money pledge?
I will make this pledge that everything that I do will be to the benefit of the people of Central Illinois, and that's the only pledge that I'm going to sign. And David, if you want to put that one together, I'd happily sign it right here tonight.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jill Deeses of the Daily Illini.
Dr. Gill, over the weekend, an American soldier in Afghanistan killed 16 Afghan citizens in an allegedly unprovoked attack. The U.S. government has said, and officials have said, that it was an isolated incident, and Barack Obama has publicly expressed condolences for their families. However, the Afghan government has condemned the attacks, and some al-Qaeda-linked militant groups have released anti-American statements. How do you think the U.S. should best respond to this incident, and what kind of relationship with Afghanistan do you think the U.S. government should strive for?
Well, even before this incident occurred last weekend, and even before the Koran burning episode occurred, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I've been saying for a long, long time that we should be exiting Afghanistan, that we should be out of there, that our presence there no longer holds any meaning for us. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, when it was designed to be when the mission was to apprehend the perpetrators of 9/11, I supported the initial invasion. But that was 12 years, almost 11 years ago now. And the perpetrator of 9/11 has been killed, and I don't think that our ongoing presence there is making life any safer for anybody here in Illinois 13, and probably not for anybody in Afghanistan. I understand that there are pressures brought to bear upon them, but along the way, our officials in Washington really became confused, if you will, with regards to muddying up, mixing up al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and it turned into a mission-building exercise, a nation-building exercise. And I think our nation has needs here, and I think that if we're going to be engaged in building, there's a lot of infrastructure crumbling here in the United States that we ought to be focused upon. And so for a long time I've said we need to exit Afghanistan.
Thank you. Mr. Gettin, your response.
In 1999, I joined the Illinois Army National Guard, and as an enlisted person, I went to basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Probably, even with my time in Afghanistan, probably the most miserable 9 weeks of my life. In 2005, when my initial service obligation was up, I took a commission as a legal officer in the Army. I didn't think when we went into Iraq that was the right answer. I didn't think when we went into Afghanistan that was the right answer. We were attacked. I thought we should have taken a different tack, but when my country called me to service, I went. The issue in Afghanistan is complex. The issue with withdrawing troops is complex. We put my brothers and sisters in arms when we withdraw them too rapidly. We have a situation over there that just logistically, for instance, the 33rd Brigade Combat Team from right here in Champaign-Urbana, it takes nearly a month to move 2,500 soldiers from where we train here in the States over to Afghanistan. It is not a situation where you could rapidly withdraw. It is a situation that we do not want to destabilize in Afghanistan for the safety, if nothing else, for the safety of our own troops over there. It was a horrible tragedy what happened this week. And actually, David and I were discussing it before we came on. I feel for the families of those victims, but you know, when you put a soldier in a rapid deployment cycle, when you put a soldier in an op tempo that soldiers were not meant to be in, and then you put them in Afghanistan, this could have been anticipated. I mean, it was exacerbated by the Koran burning. There's no question about that. I would caution about a rapid withdrawal, but I agree that we need to be out of Afghanistan.
Thank you both.
And let's go to another question back to Patrick Yeagle on military policy.
Dr. Gill, President Obama announced last month a plan to shrink the military, cancel weapons programs, and shut down bases to save money. Do you agree or disagree with this approach, and what role should the U.S. military play abroad?
I agree with President Obama's plan. As I indicated earlier, if you want to approach a $15 trillion deficit and do something about it, you need to rein in spending, and I think that's a responsible means of reining in spending. I don't think those steps proposed by the President make anybody here in Central Illinois any less safe, and so I agree with the President with regards to that.
And Mr. Gatton, your response.
Thank you. So the United States spends 42% of the world's military budget, 42% of the entire world's military budget. Is there room there to cut back? Yes, but the broken Congress, the Congress that Congressman Tim Johnson has been a part of, forced the Department of Defense to swallow a $500 billion poisonous pill when the super committee failed to come to an agreement on the budget. I think that's irresponsible. I think if you're going to make military cuts, there are ways to do it. Leon Panetta said, can we cut? Yes. Can we cut that much? It's going to be very difficult. I want everyone in this room to remain safe. I think I'm proud of my military service. I'm proud of my military. I'm proud of my country. But yes, is there room to cut in the specific cuts that the Congress is going to have the DOD take? I don't agree with that. But if we cut the programs and we take to borrow a tool of your trade, David, if we take a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer to it, I think it can be done in a rational way.
Thank you for your answer.
Let's go ahead to some questions on domestic issues, and I know we've already heard some discussion about health care issues tonight, but now a specific question from Allison Petty.
Okay. Since, Dr. Gill, since President Obama signed the Affordable Care Act in 2010, many have called it imperfect legislation. Some critics have suggested it didn't go far enough to fix systemic problems in the healthcare industry, while others have said the legislation was too intrusive on people's personal freedoms or created an undue burden on small businesses. If you were elected, would you push for additional healthcare reforms and or a repeal of any of those measures that the legislation enacted? Please be specific.
As I indicated before, I don't think that it went nearly far enough. There are a couple of good pieces to the ACA, allowing your child to stay on your policy until he turns 26 and trying to do away with the pre-existing conditions thing where they keep you out of the insurance pool, although frankly the insurance companies are already taking steps behind the scenes to deal with that and to make sure that they get their money out of the system. As I indicated, that bill, that was written by a man who's funded by $4 million from the WellPoint Insurance Company, one of the 5 big insurance companies, and that's what you get. You get something that doesn't wind up satisfactory for the American people. There's still going to be a lot of people hurting in this country, and that's, this really is a battle for the heart and soul of this party. When I listened to Mr. Gettin pledge that he'll do all good things for people, so did Senator Max Baucus. All these guys, Democrat and Republican, running for Congress, they all say they pledge to do good things for people. But you're going to do good things for people. You assuredly are going to do good things for people when you're funded by people. And so that's why I continue to harp at that. We need a national health care plan. We need a single payer, an improved Medicare for all plan. I tell a story frequently about a 39-year-old woman that I took care of a few years ago named Susan, came into my ER in cardiac arrest, and we tried to resuscitate her, and we failed. She died. And her son and 2 daughters came in after the ambulance, and he broke down crying, and he told me that a week earlier they'd been at another emergency department. She'd had chest pain. They had settled that down, and they suggested she be admitted, worked up, have a stress test. And she had the type of job, like so many people in this country do, that doesn't have health insurance. And so she and her husband looked at each other and said, we better go on home. And now a week later, here she was, stone cold dead in front of me. And only in America, every other Western developed nation has a national health care plan that doesn't let its citizens die at a rate of 1 every 12 minutes. And we just can't tolerate having people in Washington, D.C. that don't understand this problem anymore.
Thank you. Mr. Gettin.
I understand the problem to be affordable care, and I understand that the legislation that you're talking about, I won't disagree with David. I look into the second row there. My daughter, I think she's falling asleep now, but just turned 13. My son's 16. I like the fact that, boy, I know you're not going to move out of the house ever, so I like the fact that I can keep you on TRICARE until you're 25, and then you're going to have to get a job, man. But I like that. I like that pre-existing conditions are, no longer will preclude you from being covered. I like that, your insurance company can't boot you off of the policy as easily for using up a certain amount of your coverage. But it is an imperfect fix, and it is something that needs to be worked on, and I want to continue to do that. I want to be a part of that process, and that's why I'm running for Congress.
How specifically would you work on it, or what specifically would you?
Well, I have concerns currently as a former small business owner myself, and again, someone who employed less than 30 people. How is that going to affect? How's that going to affect the business climate? I agree with David that we need to get to a point in this country where health care is reasonable, and look, but it can't be on the backs of working men and women in Central Illinois, and that's what I see happening with this current bill.
Thank you.
Let's go back now to Patrick Yeagle.
Mr. Gettin, President Obama's recent proposal requiring private health insurers to cover birth control pills without raising premiums sparked controversy over what some called an attack on religious freedom. Do you believe that private health insurers serving religious organizations should cover birth control? Why or not?
I think the compromise that the president reached was the right one. As a Catholic myself, and also someone who thinks that this is an extremely important issue. As I look at my wife and my daughter in the front row there, I was outraged when I turned on the TV and they're showing the picture of 5 men debating contraceptive issues, Dave, and you saw that 5 men debating, and I think they were all Republicans, maybe I'm wrong, all debating the contraceptive issue. When I'm in Congress, everyone's going to have a seat at the table, especially women, when it comes to that issue.
Dr. Gill?
I would say, of course, that oral contraception should be available to all women in this country under that type of insurance program. More importantly, we've been having some back and forth within our campaign and Mr. Gettin's campaign over these last several days with regard to this issue and side issues associated with this. I'm someone who has done a lot of volunteer work with Planned Parenthood. I'm someone who I describe myself as being 100% pro-choice. The war on women has been going on for 39 years now since Roe v. Wade got passed. And state by state, federally as well, last year 10 bills in the Congress. Constantly, these men, for the most part, are chipping away at a woman's right to choose what to do with her body, whether that be to have an abortion, whether that be to have access to birth control. And I think that a true Democrat needs to stand up. It's the Republicans, it's the Tim Johnsons, the John Boehners, the Ronald Reagans, the George Bushes, who have turned this into a war. And if not the Democrats, who's going to stand up for a woman's right to choose and for a woman's right to have access to appropriate contraception? I've delivered hundreds of babies. I've witnessed in the emergency department dozens of miscarriages. I know a lot about reproductive health, and what I know best of all is that it's a woman's decision. It should be a woman's decision, and we must do everything possible to defend that.
David, you and I just don't disagree on that, though, and that's the issue, isn't it? We don't disagree, and when I'm out talking to people in Central Illinois, and I'm talking about jobs, and I'm talking about job creation, that's what I'm talking about. You and I simply don't disagree.
Well, I was called a liar yesterday by your campaign, and I'm not sure why. But we do disagree, Matthew. I consider myself 100% pro-choice. You were quoted in an article in July last year, the Springfield newspaper, saying, "You're a pro-choice Catholic who always chooses life." Your campaign manager on February 29th used that same quote in describing you to Jim Meadows of WILL. That's code, that you're trying to have it both ways when you talk like that. When you refuse to send in a questionnaire to Planned Parenthood, that's not consistent with 100% pro-choice. When you quoted in the Decatur newspaper 2 weeks ago, when asked about birth control and abortion, and you say, I'm hesitant to address those issues, that's not 100% pro-choice as far as I'm concerned. That's not the type of standing up for women's health issues that I think we need to see from true Democrats. And you mentioned seeing the 5 men at the hearing in Congress. There was a lot of that going on over the last 6 or 8 weeks. When those issues came up on our campaign website, on our Facebook pages, we were talking about it, and we were blasting the people that were engaged in that type of behavior. In Virginia, they're talking about inserting ultrasound transducers into women's vaginas needlessly. That's an attack. That's a threat. That's all about control of women. And I was looking eagerly for you to stand up as those issues transpired over the last 6 or 8 weeks, and I didn't see it. And so if that's the lie that I told in claiming that I'm 100% pro-choice and you're not, I don't see it as a lie, Matthew.
Mr. Gettin, if you could comment, and then we have to move on.
Well, David, as I've been saying all along, I don't think you and I disagree on this issue. When I'm out talking to voters, I hear voters talking about job creation here in Central Illinois. That's what we're out talking about. That's what I hear, and being responsive to the voters. I hear them talking about the attack on Social Security by Congressman Tim Johnson, the attack on Medicare by Congressman Tim Johnson, and that's what we're out talking about in our campaign.
Let's move on to the next question, and it's from Allison Petty of the Herald and Review.
Mr. Gettin, 17% of children in America are obese, according to the CDC. The new USDA standards for school lunches came out earlier this year, and Congress drew some criticism for some provisions, such as the determination that tomato paste in pizza constitutes a vegetable serving. Others have said that the government should have no role in telling kids what to eat. So what do you think should be the government's role in combating childhood obesity?
Well, I can say that I'm 100% certain that pizza is not a vegetable. I know that for a fact. If the government is funding school lunch programs, then I think the government can have a say in what's served to school kids in their lunches. I'm fortunate to have 2 children who apparently I'm either not feeding enough or they exercise too much. But childhood obesity is a problem that I see continuing into the future if we don't do something about it. And as far as the government funding those programs and saying what can be served, I'm okay with that.
Thank you. Dr. Gill?
I really have nothing to add. I agree with Mr. Gettin on that. It's an overwhelming problem that's getting worse decade by decade, and I think it's a very appropriate response on the part of Uncle Sam to step in. When Uncle Sam's funding the lunch, Uncle Sam ought to make it be good, healthy lunch.
Thank you.
Our next question from Jill Deeses of the Daily Illini.
Dr. Gill, when President Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996, a federal law that defined marriage as the legal union between one man and one woman and allowed states not to recognize the marriage licenses of same-sex couples from other states, there were no states that allowed same-sex couples to marry. Today, 6 states and the District of Columbia grant marriage licenses to same-sex couples. Maryland, New Jersey, and Washington have passed similar laws that have not yet taken effect. What are your thoughts on the Defense of Marriage Act today, and is it a useful law?
No, it's not at all useful. In fact, it's shameful that the Defense of Marriage Act ever got passed. This is another area of key difference between my primary opponent and I. I think that our LGBT friends should be stood up for by true Democrats, and I proudly stand up for them. They should have the freedom to marry in all 50 states of the Union. They shouldn't have to wait for Louisiana and Alabama to come in another 20 or 30 years. This is reminiscent of Virginia in the 1960s when they wouldn't let a black and a white person get married. And we're going to look back in hopefully not too many more years and say, what was going on back there in 2012 when they wouldn't let 2 consenting adults get married? So DOMA should be repealed. The Defense of Marriage Act should be repealed. And I think that Congress should work to pass a bill allowing marriage between any 2 consenting adults anywhere in this country.
Thank you. Mr. Gettin, your answer.
DOMA is unconstitutional. I believe it will be found such later this year. I like David for equality.
Thank you both.
Our next question comes from Patrick Yeagle.
Dr. Gill, President Obama and Democrats in Congress want funding to update the nation's transit infrastructure with more and better roads, bridges, runways, and rails. Meanwhile, House Republicans are pushing to cut what they deem pork barrel projects from their own transit bill. Do you support or oppose maintaining funding for transportation infrastructure projects like high-speed rail?
Most definitely. I strongly support that type of spending. And again, you can cut your spending in other areas. You can raise revenues. There's nothing wrong with taxing millionaires and billionaires more. There's nothing wrong with increasing the taxes on capital gains and dividends. Why Tim Johnson and President George Bush said that we should cut that in half in 2001 and 2003. Why somebody should pay twice as much in taxes because they sweat while they work as somebody who just goes out to the mailbox and takes a check out of the mailbox is beyond me and beyond a lot of my friends. And so there's revenue to be had to put into things like that. And you're talking about stuff that's very important there, Patrick. I tell people all the time, there's no issue that's more important. All these other issues will become moot if we don't get serious about addressing global climate change. We have a responsibility to our children, our grandchildren, and their children. I listened to Rick Santorum this week, and I thought that was vile, his questioning his description of global climate change. I'm a man of science, and global climate change is oh so real. And I used to say that we approach the midnight hour with regards to irreversibility. Sadly, we're now at the midnight hour, and they are going to look back in 2060, 2070, and they're going to say, what was going on there? Why were they playing politics with this while we now, in the future, struggle to find clean water to drink and appropriate clean air to breathe? And this is another example of these people that play politics and are funded by big oil companies, the fossil fuel companies that enrich themselves while we destroy our planet.
Thank you. And Mr. Gittin, your answer.
And earlier I addressed this, and look, I'm the only candidate in this race, Democrat or Republican, with a jobs plan, and the first point of that plan is infrastructure investment, and I addressed it earlier. We can't afford in Central Illinois or in this country to let our infrastructure crumble the way we're seeing it crumble. And again, I go back to the 255-67 corridor. I know that's a state project, but it relies on federal funding. And it's stalled out. It's stalled out in Jersey and Greene County. It's supposed to go from the Quad Cities to St. Louis. It's going to open up, I think it's going to open up the economy on that side of the state. And it's stalled out. We simply have to find a way to fund that project. It puts people back to work right now, but it's also for our long-term economic stability in Central Illinois.
Thank you, Will.
And our next question was actually going to be on climate change.
May I add something?
Please do.
We have a jobs plan as well. Mr. Gittin is not the only candidate in this race with a jobs plan. And I might add, too, that the seriousness with which a jobs plan can be implemented, the seriousness with which it can be implemented is directly related to whether or not you're allowed to push forward, whether or not you're going to receive funding from corporate America that would prefer that another NAFTA come down the pike and take jobs out of this country. If you need to sign on to that because of the people, the Washington, D.C. insiders that have involved themselves in Mr. Gittin's campaign, if they insist that he be a part of another free trade agreement, then it's going to be difficult for him to turn them down. Whereas me, who is funded by $10 checks from Decatur, I'll be glad to save Decatur a lot more jobs by turning down the next NAFTA that comes down the pike.
David, when I'm out there every day talking to men and women in Central Illinois about jobs, about that is the focus of my campaign, and you've been critical of that. When I look at the supporters, my supporters in the front row here, these are the people that support me. I take offense at your suggestion, and especially when there's no merit to it.
And I want to touch back on the remarks that Dr. Gill made about climate change. That was going to be our next question. Yeah. For the sake of time, Allison, if I could just bring that question to Mr. Gittin, your thoughts about the climate change issue, and would you support any specific measures to address it?
Well, when I went to law school at Southern Illinois University, I didn't, unfortunately, my dad's sitting in the back there, an old prosecutor. Unfortunately, Dad, I didn't go to law school to become a prosecutor, even though that's how it's turned out. I went to law school and had a keen interest in environmental law and environmental issues. And of course it's real. Like David stated, to state otherwise is absurd. specific issues that can be addressed. Look, when we talk about jobs here in Central Illinois, we talk about energy production, domestic energy production. We have technology now that can be put into place where we can not only wean ourselves off of foreign oil and energy, but we can do it in a cleaner way that some of these other countries are doing it. We have that capacity right here in Central Illinois, and I think we need to leverage it.
Thank you very much. Let's go to another question from Jill Deeses.
Mr. Gettin, in January, the Stop Online Piracy Act, or SOPA, and similar bills received a lot of attention and criticism for what detractors said was an attempt to stifle free speech and innovation. The bill as written would have allowed the government to shut down any website that displayed any kind of copyright infringement, no matter what it might be in a YouTube comment or a blog post or what have you. But proponents claim that new copyright laws are essential to revitalizing the intellectual property markets. Are you in favor of the resurgence of a bill like the Stop Online Piracy Act?
I think that intellectual property does need to be protected. It's very delicate and intricate. When you're talking about the internet, it does need to be protected. But I think Congress backing away from SOPA was maybe the only good move they've made in the last 12 months as I've been watching Congress. I see the internet as something that when I was here as an undergraduate in the early 90s, the University of Illinois at that time had one of 3 supercomputers here. And so the internet was in its infancy. When I think forward to today and my children learning online, people shopping online, we need to preserve that. But SOPA, to use a prosecutor term, you didn't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody was stealing intellectual property. As you stated, someone could just simply make a blog post from another terminal. They could shut it down with no prior notice, and I think it was a horrible bill. But we need to balance privacy, First Amendment rights with intellectual property rights. That just didn't do it.
Then I do have a follow-up for you. So if you were to be in Congress and to be, toying around with this idea of this, protecting intellectual property, what do you propose then would be kind of the solution to protect
it just has to be a better balancing between what is, intellectual property rights that are important and that are owned by a person versus the openness of the internet. I guess I would say, I know I come into my office, I turn my computer on, and my internet works. And so from that standpoint, if you're asking me what specific buzzers and whistles I need to put on my machine to prevent that, I don't know. But it's got to be a better balancing act than SOPA.
I should note 2 minutes, Dr. Gill.
I think SOPA was a huge mistake, and of course Congress should have backed away. The fact that Congress went forward at all with something such as that is just further proof that Congress is run by the big dollar interests. And we need to fight back. This has been a 40-year battle where the productivity gains in this country have accumulated to the richest, not 1%, 1/10 of 1% of this society, the ones that run the companies that run Congress, and the policies such as SOPA, such as the trade agreements that we've talked about, health care reform that didn't have a public option. We need a different type of Congress. Mr. Gettin, when you were asked at a Christmas party at the Champaign County Democrats put on whether you would join me in turning down corporate cash and Wall Street bank cash, you laughed at the concept. You can say that your supporters are here in the front row. Your supporters ultimately, should you continue with this, with your Washington, D.C. insiders in association with your campaign, your supporters will be something else altogether.
David, if you're willing to say that, then you, sir, are willing to do or say anything you can to get to Congress, and that's exactly what's wrong with Congress.
We have just under 2 minutes left. I'm going to ask one last very quick question. And this is on term limits, and an idea which Tim Johnson, the incumbent, has been criticized for embracing voluntarily but turning down later on. Very quickly, starting with you, Dr. Gill, would you support or oppose a constitutional amendment for some form of congressional term limits?
I've stated for years, Jim, that yes, I support term limits on our U.S. representatives and our senators. Just as we passed an amendment in 1951 to term limit presidents, we should do the same. A lot of my friends tell me the downsides to it. I think the upside outweighs the downside. I would add, Mr. Gettin, that you might have the support of the power brokers in Washington, D.C., the Senator
I'm sorry, we're really running out of time. I want to give Mr. Gettin a chance to answer that question. Would you support a constitutional amendment or oppose it for some form of term limits?
Jim, I would oppose a constitutional amendment. Not that that idea is foreign to me, but in using my office as an example, county-wide offices, there's a great deal of institutional knowledge that you gain over several periods of time. But the Constitution, I don't know if term limits, I mean, how would they be? How many would it be? I just don't see us getting to the threshold that we need to get to even have that be an issue.
Thank you very much. And we are out of time. That concludes this debate featuring Matt Gettin and David Gill, Democratic candidates for Congress in Illinois' 13th Congressional District. Our thanks to the candidates and their campaigns, our panel of reporters, and our audience, both here in the studio and following on TV, radio, and online. On behalf of Illinois Public Media, our thanks to the League of Women Voters of Illinois for making this evening possible. You can watch this debate again online at will.illinois.edu/election. And remember, the Illinois primary is next Tuesday, March 20th. Good night.